Waheguru Ji Ki Khalsa, Waheguru Ji Ki Fateh. It's an absolute pleasure to have you all in Parliament today. We were chatting earlier, and I think it's been now some years since there has been a mass Sikh lobby in Parliament, so it is wonderful that everybody is able to come in today. And thank you so much for doing that. And what I always say to people is that this is your building, this is your Parliament. You should feel part of this and feel free to come in whenever you want to come and visit your MPs outside of this lobby, because it is very much for you to come here. I'm very proud to represent Glasgow Central constituency, and 3 of Glasgow's 4 Gurdwaras are located in my constituency area. So I very much appreciate the contribution that the Sikh community brings to Scotland and to Glasgow. And in reading over the briefing that was so helpfully sent before this event, I'd read through the letter that was sent from Gurdwaras up and down these islands to the Prime Minister with the concerns that the community have. And I want to acknowledge and to recognise those concerns and the worries that you have with that. It's very clear that there has become a perception that the UK government are not recognising and standing up for the Sikh community, and worse, that there is, in some cases, some vilification of the Sikh community, and that is deeply concerning in a country where everybody should feel welcome and everybody should feel part of society. And I would like to say, certainly, that the Bloom Review has not helped that perception at all. And I think that needs to be debated further and further challenged within Parliament. Because that is, if those perceptions become further embedded, that is a deeply harmful state of affairs. And I also want, as you will expect, as a Scottish National Party Member of Parliament, the issue of self-determination is something that I take particularly seriously. And any suggestion that those seeking self-determination are extremists would certainly put me in an odd place as well, because if that was being applied to you, it would apply equally to people seeking Scottish independence as well, which I think would be entirely inappropriate. But I want to also mention the issue of Jagtar Singh Johal, and who's the constituent of my colleague Martin Docherty Hughes, and we had a briefing on the situation facing Jaggy last week, and it is deeply concerning, again, that the UK government has not stood up for Jagtar and his case to the extent that they ought to have done. If it was anybody being detained by another government on spurious claims, which is the case here, you would expect your government to have your back. And it is deeply worrying for everybody, and particularly for the Sikh community, for anybody who wishes to go and travel in the way that he did. That you cannot guarantee that the UK government has your back on that, and my colleagues and I will continue to push for more on that case, because it seems very clear to me and to others that there is very little chance of a fair trial should a trial ever properly commence. So my colleagues and I will continue to raise that wherever we can do. But I don't want to kind of detain people in this room too long. I want to be able to have those conversations and to make use of your time here as part of this lobby. So I'm more than happy to hand over, and we can discuss further the issues that you've come here to raise, because I think they are all incredibly important, and I want to make sure that everybody has their chance to have their say.
The briefing that you had this morning has gone to every single member of Parliament, and so the issues we're raising today should not surprise them. Let me just set out very briefly. So on the 24th of April, a letter that Alison referred to went to Rishi Sunak. It's now been over 2 months. And it's not just we're talking to the people in this room, but through Akal Channel, we're talking to Sikhs across the globe. They need to understand in that letter, there were a number of very specific issues raised. And I will just focus on 2 of them, which is Boris Johnson, whether we like him or we hate him, did as Prime Minister apologise to those Gurdwaras and organisations for a mistake he made when he did not acknowledge the Gurpurab of Guru Nanak Dev Ji, and said in writing on the 7th of July 22, about half an hour before he resigned, that that mistake would not be repeated under his watch, to be fair. Now, Rishi Sunak became Prime Minister, didn't acknowledge Guru Nanak Dev Ji's Gurpurab, did not put out any message for Vaisakhi. And so that letter on the 24th of April was saying, yes, you may have other more important things to do when you became Prime Minister, but actually a Prime Minister is not one person. It has a whole army of people. He will have religious advisors that will tell him about important days in people's calendars. And the second, slightly more serious issue, I would say, was in that letter on the 7th of July, Boris Johnson had written to Keir Starmer to acknowledge that Jagtar Singh Johal was in arbitrary detention. But more importantly, the letter he sent to Godler as an organisation on the 7th of July went further, and he said he'd been in arbitrary detention since November 2017. Now, since Rishi Sunak became Prime Minister, there's been some backtracking. And I know Martin's raised it in Parliament and was not getting a straight answer, but I think the straight answer is they have genuinely backtracked. Because once you say a British national is arbitration, you must follow your own policy, ask for their release, and in this case, return to his family in Scotland. So we're still pushing for Rishi Sunak to respond to Godler as an organisation. And what's even more disturbing is members of Parliament from across the political spectrum that have written to Rishi Sunak. None of them have had a response either. And this is more than 2 months later. That's where this lobby starts. And in that letter, we did talk about the Sikh homeland issue in some detail. And that's precisely why this lobby is deliberately referred to as the Sikh homeland lobby, because we wanted to discuss it in Parliament. Sitting and discussing and arguing and debating is actually part of a democratic society. And secondly, Alison's alluded to the Bloom Review. The Bloom Review came out on the 26th of April, 2 days after that letter was sent, and introduced a phrase called pro-Khalistan extremism. Phrase never used by government. And it was quite surprising. I know we have had letters from members of Parliament, again across the political spectrum, singing the praises of the Sikh community, but actually the official response that's come back from government through the Faith Minister is the Bloom Review has made a number of recommendations. We will take on board the feedback that has been given. Now, Colin Bloom will be appearing for the London Faith Forum on the 4th of July. He'll be challenged there as well by not just Sikhs, but non-Sikhs as well. But the key thing about the Bloom Review is, where did that phrase come from? That phrase, I can guarantee you, didn't come from any of the 21,000 respondents, because those questions have been asked of the department. Can they share how many of those 21,000 respondents raised the issue of pro-Khalistan extremism? And the fact that they can't answer that question means it puts a question mark over that review. Now, the other letter I want to refer to is a letter from Tom Tugendhat. I think Guy Opperman's going to be joining us, who is a Conservative MP from Exham. And he's had a letter from Tom Tugendhat, who is many will regard as a friend of the Sikhs. And I think he's the minister responsible in the Home Office for security. And what he said is there is a dedicated team within the Home Office that is looking to disrupt pro-Khalistan extremists. Now, I know, and I've brushed off some of those members of Parliament, it didn't matter that they were Labour, Conservative. Most of them are shocked that the government have put resources into a dedicated team to look at an issue that the police and the intelligence services, and yesterday we had a meeting with the counter-terrorism network. There were about 40 people that were on that meeting. And they said there is no threat from Sikhs. There are no live cases, but they can't control politicians. Now, the other thing we did was on the 19th of June, we sent a follow-up letter to Rishi Sunak. Most of you know the sad demise of Avtar Singh Handa on the 15th of June. But more seriously, the killing of Hardeep Singh Nijjar on the 18th of June. So that letter was sent to Rishi Sunak saying there are people now dying. And we really brought out that on the 4th of February 2023, Rishi Sunak met Ajit Doval, a national security advisor, with Tim Barrow, his counterpart. We've known about it since then because, unfortunately for Rishi Sunak, Ajit Doval tweeted about it with a photo. It is very unusual for a Prime Minister of a country to sit in on a meeting between two national security advisors, the American national security advisor, the German one, the French one, the Canadian one. Does he sit in those meetings? The answer is probably not. This special gesture, as India called it, is a real worrying sign if at the same time you've got a dedicated team within the Home Office. And now, the thing that a lot of MPs were talking about in the lobby was they were shocked that the National Intelligence Agency of India has been sharing on social media photographs and video footage from Sikhs protesting in London. What the counter-terrorism police told us yesterday, that is a criminal offence because they deem it hostile activity by a foreign country. Now, it's fine saying that. The point is, victims here are the Sikh community as a whole. I know people across, hold different political views from the community. They are shocked that on the one hand, politicians say how big a contribution this community makes in this country, how we're law-abiding. And people that deal with crime, that deal with terrorism, probably agree. They do not have a difficulty with the Sikh community. However, politicians in government, I wouldn't say all politicians in government, and in key areas of responsibility, starting with the Prime Minister, have really maligned the entire Sikh community. Now, that's the context of Sikh homeland lobby, because what's clearly emerging, the issue of the Sikh homeland is what really bothers India. And I don't think we've had a lobby specifically on the issue of the Sikh homeland. Yes, we talk about it in our Gurudwaras, we talk about it in our media. And actually, these various letters that we refer to, the briefing sent, set out very clear to every single member of Parliament some key facts when it comes to a Sikh homeland. Firstly, as Alison said, the right to self-determination is a basic human right. This applies to everyone. And I would argue any UK politician that has a problem with the right to self-determination then has a problem with a basic human right. And it could be the Scottish people, the Sikh people, or others. So that is a really important starting point, that professing your right to self-determination and talking about independence is not illegal. It's your right in this country. Second thing is, and this is really, we couldn't be having this debate in Canada, in America, in any other country with large numbers of Sikhs, but we can have it in Britain, which is the Sikhs had a kingdom. And under that kingdom, there were two Anglo-Sikh wars, and the British annexed the Sikh kingdom in 1849. Therefore, having that debate in this country about, that we had a Sikh kingdom, after all, you annexed it. And then for 100 years, and the reason why we're saying this, and we're saying it through the media, and we're saying it in Parliament, is we have to be confident when we talk to our members of Parliament in our constituencies, when they come for your votes, ask them about these issues. Because if we don't, then they'll happily go away and say, you're going to vote for us. You've never raised these issues. For 100 years, more than 100 years, from 1849 right the way through to, say, Indian independence, Sikhs sacrificed their lives in massive numbers for Britain. First World War, Second World War. And what did we get? We got the Jallianwala Bagh massacre after the First World War. We got the Nankana Sahib massacre in 1921. And Sikhs sacrificed their numbers in huge numbers in terms of the independence struggle. And a lot of you know these facts, but we don't challenge British politicians to say, look what the Sikhs have done. Look at our 200-year history with Britain. We had a kingdom. In 1947, a Labour Prime Minister, Clement Attlee, offered Sikhs a homeland because there were three parties at the discussion: the Muslim League, the Indian Congress, and Sikhs. They recognised that Sikhs were on a level playing field with the other two majority communities. I'm not going to go into what actually happened, other than it's a fact that the Sikh leadership at the time decided to stay with India. Now, partition is very rarely talked about in this house. Partition was disastrous. The way Britain left in 1947. But what we don't talk about is, yes, whether there were Sikhs, whether they were Muslims, whether they were Hindus, they all suffered. There was mass killings. People were left homeless. But don't forget, Sikhs constituted a minute fraction of the Indian population in 1947. And who suffered the most in terms of a minority community? It was the Sikhs, because Punjab was split down the middle. Nankana Sahib, birthplace of Guru Nanak Dev Ji, sits in Pakistan. Amritsar sits more or less on the border. We have to be able to talk to our politicians and say, this is our history with Britain. Britain offered us a homeland. They divided our homeland. And Sikhs have suffered since 1947. And I'm going to stop in a minute, because this is really important to get across to through the media to the masses. But also these issues around how the Prime Minister perceives the Sikh community, how the Bloom Review has deliberately tried to put us into a box, and how we need to be confident enough to raise the Sikh homeland issue. Because what happened since 1947 happened in 1984. What's happening even now with the likes of Jagtar Singh Johal or Deep Singh Nijjar is here with us today. It's here in the diaspora. Now, my final point on this, for perhaps I think Jazz will probably want to say one or two words, is at the end of this briefing, we have said to members of Parliament, within the next 7 days, we will be issuing a survey to all MPs. 18 questions, covering a range of issues, including the issues we're raising today. But questions like, and let me just focus on Jagtar Singh Johal, one very simple question: do you believe Jagtar Singh Johal is in arbitrary detention? We want every single member of Parliament to respond to that one question. Yes or no? Clearly, the follow-up question that is, therefore, do you think the UK government should follow its policy and call for his immediate release? These questions and this survey will form the basis on which Sikhs will decide how they support politicians at next year's general election. There will be questions around the right to self-determination. There will be the question of, do you, as a member of Parliament, recognise pro-Khalistan extremism in your constituency? Do you see it in your Gurdwaras? And one final thing I forgot to mention, but it was really important. The Colin Bloom report, there's lots of flaws in it. But one thing that perhaps has been lost on many is he had 21,000 respondents. And like I said, I think a very small fraction of none raised the issue of pro-Khalistan extremism. However, he's put quotes in there that are spreading hate about Gurdwaras, Sikh organisations, and our religious practices. I don't think, and he didn't in his 168, but any comment from anyone that was Islamophobic, anti-Semitic. But why was he allowed to publish on the government's website specific comments attacking Gurdwaras, attacking Gurmat camps, attacking the Anand Karj? These are things that if we don't ask our members of Parliament, then this will be our history in this country. These things will go into, and civil servants will be talking about and using this language. And the fact that Home Office already now has a dedicated team looking at pro-Palestine extremism, means we must challenge this. I'm going to stop there, Alison, because I would have gone into other things if members of Parliament hear about some of the questions we're going to pose today. But I'm sure Jazz will want to say a few words, because I'm sure I've forgotten a few things.
And we all know the purpose of today's lobby. And as Dabinderjeet said, we've held many lobbies in Parliament over the years, particularly on issues relating to the rights of Sikhs in the UK, whether they be the Kirpan, the Kara, the Dastar. All of these kakars have been threatened in one way or another by either UK legislation or policy. And we've had to come to this house to lobby our politicians and explain to them what these articles of faith actually mean for Sikhs. And we've been very successful in those lobbies. The Offensive Weapons Bill in 2018, as that was going through Parliament, would have, had it not been checked by people like Dabinderjeet Singh, Sukhwinder Singh, the APPG for British Sikhs, and Preet Kaur Gill, and a number of other MPs, it would have outlawed the Kirpan, the Baddi Kirpan that we all have. It would have been illegal to carry in public, and that includes Panj Pyare. I know we've got just Bajasbir Singh, who's one of the Panj Pyare at the June rally and many other Sikh events. It would have been illegal to have them in Gurdwara, that we have many Shastra in the forefront of Sri Guru Granth Sahib Ji Maharaj, and it would have been illegal to carry them at home or keep them at home. And it's for those lobbies that your support and attendance and contacting your MP, we were able to reverse that bill and actually put in provisions and protections and defence for Sikhs to carry the Kirpan. But these are issues that the Sikh community face on a day-to-day basis, whether it's injustice for Jagtar Singh Johal, who's been incarcerated for nearly 6 years, whether it's the failed extradition attempt of 3 British-born nationals to India without any evidence, without any investigation or trial in the UK, or whether it's through the work, pressure, I'd say, from foreign governments on the Charity Commission to put pressure on many of you guys as Gurdwara Parbandhaks and management committees of Gurdwaras, that your Gurdwaras are breaking the law because you're raising issues relevant to the Sikh community, which is within our faith in the Miri Piri concept. And it's these basic principles that civil servants, politicians sometimes overlook, that our places of worship are not just places of worship. In Sikhi, the Miri Piri concept of temporal and spiritual goals are inseparable. Politics and religion for us go hand in hand. And you can't have politics without religious oversight, and you can't have a religion that flourishes if you don't have political leadership and governance. So the two actually are inseparable, and that's what our faith teaches us, and that's what we practice. But it's actually this lobby is on issues even higher than those. This lobby is about our actual existence, in that we can exist as a free and sovereign community, faith, and as individuals. Our gurus have made us sovereign and fully independent. We only bow our heads to our guru, Sri Guru Granth Sahib Ji Maharaj. No other state, no government, no power, no other faith, no religious institute is higher than our guru. And our guru is sovereign, and we are sovereign. And it's these concepts and principles which often ministers, politicians, civil servants overlook. And when we talk about our right to self-determination, this is what this lobby is for. It's about the Sikh homeland lobby, which is our existence. We are probably the largest community that doesn't have a homeland. So when we have issues, all the issues we talked about, whether they are identity issues, whether they're hate crime issues that we've lobbied here in Parliament for, nobody speaks up for them. You can have India claim the Sikhs are part of India, but I don't recall one instance where India has actually raised the concerns of a Sikh that suffered a hate crime. I don't recall one instance where the government of India have raised the concern that a Gurdwara was attacked. I don't recall any incident of the Indian government standing up for your rights when your children are denied entry to schools because of their turbans or their card or their identity. I don't see the Indian government or any government standing up for your right to be counted and recognized in this country as tax-paying citizens. If you're successful or you win, excel in your sports or any particular field in your business or professional career, they're very quick to claim you as Indian as opposed to Sikh. But actually, the issues that the community face are often overlooked. And there's a massive reason for that. And that reason is that they're probably directly or indirectly responsible for those issues that we face. So without an established government that is going to speak to you, then our issues and as individuals, we become invisible. There is no embassies around the world for Sikhs that if we had an issue, we would go to. We had the turban and the dastar is still banned in France today, 20 years on, because no one is raising it. We don't have the support to raise these issues. The Kirpan was nearly banned in Italy. The Sikh faith and the religion's own existence and recognition is being challenged by the Italian government. And we have issues like this across all of mainland Europe. But these issues exist simply because we are without our homeland. And we lost our homeland in 1849 when the British annexed Punjab. And our struggle for freedom and re-establishment, because this isn't something new. We're not asking for foreign governments or other countries to create as a homeland. We're just asking and demanding that our homeland be recognized. We already have a homeland. Its borders are defined. Its language is defined. Its history is defined. Its culture is defined. Its people are defined. The only missing issue is the world isn't recognizing who we are. And I want to read Article 1 of the United Nations Charter, which is the founding principle on which these values are built and democracy is built. And that clearly states to develop friendly relations amongst nations based on respect for the principle of equal rights and self-determination of people, and to take other appropriate measures to strengthen universal peace. It's a founding principle, Article 1 of the United Nations Charter, that every individual has the right to determine their own future. Our claim as Sikhs for self-determination and our freedom and our homeland is both a historic and a legal one. There are treaties in this country, whether in the History Museum or in the British Library or in Parliament, treaties signed by the British government at the time under the annexation of Punjab, which declared the Sikh homeland. Treaties that were overlooked in 1945 when partition was being drawn up. And treaties that have been ignored ever since, especially since 1984. And that year is an important one because up until then, the right and the claim for a Sikh homeland was what we called internal self-determination. The promises made to the Sikhs by the governing Congress that you will be free to practice your religion in the north of Punjab, in the north of India, without any hindrance or interference. That is what we call internal self-determination. As a state, you govern yourselves. That is the federal system of India. But born out of oppression and genocide of 1984, the Sikh nation declared that we can no longer live within this internal self-determination. The future for Sikhs can only be as an external, independent, sovereign country. When a community is harassed, is discriminated, and is killed by the state, like the Sikhs were in 84, there is no alternative to independent sovereignty and freedom. How can you live in a system in which the police officers whose duty is to protect and serve are the ones that are raping our sisters, our mothers, murdering our elderly, and making the youth of Punjab flee for their lives? And when those youths, to protect themselves in self-defense, the only route they know is to defend themselves and fight back, are then deemed terrorists and extremists, and then the whole judiciary is misused to punish them. Pick up individuals from the age of 14 and incarcerate them in prisons without charge, without trial, some for up to 30 years. How can you have faith in a system whose politicians are hell-bent on destroying the very fabric of our history, of our culture, of our faith? All of us have seen, these aren't all personal opinions. The last 70 years have shown how successive governments of India have discriminated against Punjab. Whether it's of the people of Punjab, whether it's the language of Punjab, and Punjab was split further into two based on linguistics. Again, which was a strategy to shrink Punjab to the Punjabi-speaking majority of the Sikhs. They've attacked the education system. Punjabi is not taught in our schools. Education is being manipulated and altered to change history of what the Qurbaniyan and the sacrifices of our gurus for their sovereignty, that is now being replaced with for the sanctity of India. And the damage that's doing is being felt in this house. Because in the House of Lords, you have certain lords that stand up and will preach that the gurus were only there to serve and protect India. India wasn't even formed or created in the times of the gurus. So it's absolute, complete, misapplied information that is being pushed out, that narrative of what Sikhs actually stand for. The resources of Punjab have been targeted and depleted, whether it's the river waters or more recently, as the whole world witnessed, the farmers' protest, the land grab tactics of the Indian Modi government to take ownership, illegal ownership of the fertile land of Punjab. And that was met with resistance. Or the general economic conditions. We're now seeing a mass influx in this country, in Canada, a migration of Sikh youth because of the drug-infelled and alcoholic-fueled situation that they find themselves in. These are the factors of the silent genocide that we're seeing in Punjab. Now, as a result of that, in recent times, Punjab itself has seen a resurgence and an awakening for them to be free. For them to be free. There's only so much persecution and oppression any people will take. And if that persecution and that oppression and that discrimination is from your own governments, then the only solution is for you to seek freedom. And the freedom for Punjab is Khalistan. So, with it being our historic and legal right, with it being a fundamental basic right of democracies around the world, over 160 countries signed up to the UN Charter. So, when we have the people of Punjab standing up and saying we want to be free, and we want to democratically be recognized as an independent country, we've gone through a time where there was an armed struggle. And I've talked about the reasons for that. When the state is the one hunting you, your only alternative is to fight back. When the state destroys the most sacred shrine of the Sikhs, the city Darbar Sahib and Akal Takht, the only way back is to fight back. But that struggle ended in the mid-90s. Now it's an intellectual battle, a democratic battle, which is being through the ballot box, through lobbying MPs. But now what we're seeing is against that threat, because of the majority feeling in most Punjabis, not just Sikhs, but all Punjabis to be free, that we saw in the streets of Delhi for 1 year. For 1 year, 250 million people were protesting for a year. The largest protest in human history. That wasn't just about farm laws. That protest was about self-existence and about freedom. And that was the biggest signal to India that there is a grassroots demand for freedom. And anyone who elevates that or speaks to that, we've seen how they've been demonized. Whether it's Amritpal Singh in Punjab, or whether it's Avtar Singh Kanda in the UK, or whether it's by Hardeep Singh Nijjar in Canada. All three have been either arrested, detained, or have been killed. For democratically, politically campaigning for a fundamental, basic human right. So these are the issues why Khalistan is important. And the challenge we're placing on politicians today is, why is it when we democratically campaign for a basic human right, when the foundation of democracy in this country and the West is going out there as foreign policy, and some would say gifting, some would say forcefully delivering this level of democracy on other countries, then why is it not standing up and allowing Sikhs that same right? Why will it challenge China, challenge Russia, challenge other countries, but it can't challenge India on its human rights record, on its discrimination of minorities? They're not just Sikhs, they include Christians, they include Muslims and others. So our lobby today is to ask politicians that why would they not stand up and support the Sikhs' right to self-determination? Why is it just a Sikh thing? Why is that right okay for people in Scotland, and the third largest party in Parliament, the SNP, can take up 40-odd benches in the Commons and demand their right to self-determination and their freedom, and have a referendum, and then campaign for another referendum, and I'm sure they'll continue that fight until they are free, which is their absolute legal right? Then why is it, if Sikhs peacefully campaign for their right, having been tortured, having gone through 2 genocides in recent times, why is it that we are labelled extremists and terrorists? And why are individuals elected to this house being afforded the freedom to abuse their right and calling us terrorists and extremists? Why is the Home Secretary of this country, former Home Secretary, being given platforms to peddle that narrative? Because what's happened is, when the senior politicians of this country, whether it's Priti Patel, whether it's Bob Blackman, whether it's Lord Ranger, whether it's anyone else, when they abuse their own democracy and call Sikhs out as radicals, extremists, without any evidence, without any data, they undermine their own democracy. And that's how it starts to crumble. So we're here as a response, because what's happened is, when senior politicians in the UK opened the door to that kind of rhetoric and that kind of demonization, then countries like India abuse it. And Davinderji mentioned how there's a task force now set up in the Home Office. And we asked the question why. We asked a number of politicians today, some of them ministers in the government, can they explain why is there a specific task force looking at Sikh extremism in the Home Office when there is absolute no record or any data or any threat or any open investigation, no risk of extremism, of terrorism from the CTU or any of the police authorities? So then why is there a need for a specific task force, if only to please India? And that threat has now even crossed a dangerous line, in that we are now seeing foreign intelligence agents operating on UK soil. We've seen individuals gathering surveillance footage and evidence at the June rally, at protest outside the Indian High Commission, all actions that are completely illegal, all under the nose of the British police. And that's being shared on social media. And politicians are completely ignorant to this fact. Some of the politicians we spoke to today were shocked. That raises the question, do they even know what's happening in here? And that's where it comes our duty to come here and inform them and demand that they raise these issues. And now, unfortunately, in the last 2 weeks, we've seen the severe, dire consequences of that interference and that unabated approach of Indians of how they act in this country. And that's been with the tragic deaths of the Sikh activist of Dar Singh Khanda and Hardeep Singh Nizar. A president of one of the largest gurdwaras in Canada was shot in the premises of that gurdwara. Now, how many more people need to die before politicians, and need to die in this sort of country for politicians to take this threat seriously? So, in closing, I just want to really press upon all of those who have been attending the lobby today, those watching, that until we raise these issues with our politicians, either in the House of Commons or locally in your constituencies, we are allowing them to do this. We are allowing them to get away with these things. And we are then, by default, complicit. We have to challenge, we have to stand up for it, and our politicians are elected by us, and they need to know that we will not stand for it, and that they must do more, and they must follow and implement their own laws that they have made in this house, and apply those laws to every other citizen and every other external body that is operating here, and hold them accountable, and not put impunitive actions on the Sikh community that go against their own laws. So those are the key demands that we need to ask for. There's nothing wrong in calling for Khalistan. We need to completely remove that veil of taboo and demonization that's been laid at it by the Indian authorities for the last 40 years. And we should all be proud and open to speak about our right to self-determination. Whether you agree with it or not, you have the right to. And that's what we're here in the House of Commons today for, and the Homeland Lobby is fundamentally about, is allowing and respecting other people's right to demand their own future. Waheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Waheguru Ji Ki Fateh.
Report, because the terms of reference of the report was, does government do God? And so this was clearly supposed to be a report focused on how government engages with faith communities. And what actually happened in the report is that the author of the report, he says that this was his opinion, went outside the terms of reference. He's not an expert in counter-terror. He doesn't have a background in this area. So it was quite shocking, I think, for all of us as a Sikh community to see the kind of speculative, remarks made in there. But also, if you look at his evidence base, it was using Wikipedia. It was using things that weren't actually relevant to this country. Now, what we can't have a situation is that the Sikh community have lived here for decades, law-abiding, contributing to society, and then this, idea that our human rights campaign is being used as a sort of a narrative around seen to be Sikh extremism. Now, I had raised a point of order in the House saying that actually language does matter, and politicians especially need to be wary of the kind of language that they are using when they are describing the Sikh community. That's not to say that we don't know that there is some elements of extreme views in all communities, and of course there are processes, there are mechanisms that the government has in terms of addressing those. But if you look at the government's own evidence base, its own counter-terror reports, if you look at everything else it holds, there is no evidence is what it suggests. So this idea, in terms of what was put into Blue, was a shock for all the community, because suddenly we were being told something when we look at the government's own evidence base, it didn't actually exist. So what we are saying as a community is you can't have it both ways. You've got to be absolutely categorical what you mean by the term extremism, what you mean by the term supporters, and what you mean by human rights. Because fundamentally, Sikhs are, raising issues which are about basic human rights. And this has been going on for decades. And there's so much evidence about suppression of voices, how the community have been discriminated against. What we don't want to see in the United Kingdom is communities that have lived side by side for decades being pitted against one another. And what we don't want to see is interference from any other governments in terms of how we live, how we contribute to the United Kingdom, and how we live peacefully
with other communities. And actually, our gurdwaras are open. We engage with all politicians. We always invite them in. We ask them to have a dialogue with us. And that is really important. We as a community must continue to invite politicians of all stripes to come in, to talk to us, to learn, to understand the lived experience that many of you are here today can actually talk about, because you were there when those atrocities took place, when the genocide took place, when those fundamental human rights against the Sikh community took place. So I think it's really, really important that we hold our politicians to account. We make sure that the language that they use is absolutely appropriate. And of course, many of us on the All-Party Parliamentary Group for British Sikhs are cross-party. We do care about these issues. We engage with our Sikh constituents on a regular basis, and we understand that a rights movement, a rights campaign can't be then used to frame our community to be extremist or have different views, because actually that is not the issue. And now we know that there's a lot of disinformation out there. I think what Bloom did really was antagonize our community. I have written to Michael Gove. I've asked him very, very clearly, does he agree with this report? Does he want to distance himself from the report? And can he share the evidence base for some of the issues that were put into the report? But I've got to say this to our community. Bloom did say on Newsnight that this was his personal opinion. And all of us should just, really think through how it is that government is allowing, appointing people to undertake a report and then make it about their personal opinion. That is never what it should have been about. And clearly that report should have been, somebody should have had oversight over it and had a look at it before it was actually put out. Now, the questions we need to ask: what were the terms of reference? Who paid for the report? Because was it taxpayers' money? And what was the contribution of government in terms of making sure that there was transparency, that there was openness, and that they were able to see what kind of information came into the consultation? If we need to undertake freedom of information requests, we should be asking this basic information from our elected representatives who are there to represent us here in the House of Commons about the very things that they are then using back to frame the community as being something that they clearly are not. You all engage with your politicians in your respective areas. Gurdwaras are open, you're engaging, you contribute to the wider community. And whilst this is accepted and applauded, and, we have lots of people saying how wonderful the Sikh community is, they were always there helping them, they contributed to World War I, but actually we have a moment and an opportunity to educate our politicians. 1859, Punjab was taken over by the British. It was the last place in India to be taken over. And the idea that we didn't have our Raj is just unacceptable, that people do not want to read their history and they are so lazy. But it is incumbent upon us as a community to make sure that we are educating the very people that are there to represent us, and that we do hold them to account. So I'm going to probably leave it there, because I know you have so much that you want to say. But just to say, as the chair of the All-Party Parliamentary Group, Alison has been absolutely phenomenal, as have other MPs. We will continue to push the government, because at the end of the day, this is all about where is the evidence. And that is what we've got to call the government to be able to produce. Vaiguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Vaiguru Ji Ki Fateh.
Absolutely. Well, the Home Office. But actually what we're experiencing is that censorship and silencing of a minority community, talking about factual events. So where we've had a relationship with certain people in Meta, Facebook, Insta, we've raised these issues, saying, how can you ban a post that is on Wikipedia? Or is actually a factual event? There's a glorification of it, and then they were doing it. But as a community, we have no reach to those platforms. And I think it's a question of what are social media platforms doing to protect minority communities talking about oppression? Because whilst there's a freedom of speech aspect to it, a lot of countries, and we saw Jack, CEO of Twitter, and Elon Musk say, look, we have to follow the rule of India. And India threatened to shut us down and arrest our employees. Therefore, we want to ban accounts. I mean, many of us have our Twitter pages banned in India. But I guess as politicians, we're asking, what can you do to those platforms when they're being asked around safeguarding the other way? Yes, safeguarding hate is important, but actually allowing those minorities to exercise their freedom and share issues of repression is just as important.
Yeah. I think that's a really interesting way of looking at from both sides of it as well. I think there is an awful lot more that social media companies should be doing, both to protect people's freedoms and protect people from hate online as well. I hope that the bill, I don't know if you can say more about the bill. I hope that when the bill finally makes its way through Parliament, that there will be more accountability for social media. But it remains to be seen how exactly that will work out in the end.
I'm going to sum up is probably some of the actions should come from surveys lobbying. And this is no particular order. So one we talked about is the survey of MPs was up at deals, almost ammunition to go back to the government with. That's going to cover 1984 genocide and EU-led priority, because these are all matters that have been raised. Secondly, I think parliamentary questions around two or three things. One is, I guess, a lack of response from Rishi Sunak, you suggested. The other one around the Bloom review. And slightly more delicate one is how to handle coming out the Home Office around pro-Palestinian trees and having a dedicated seat, because I think a debate almost certainly wouldn't happen this side of the recess. It would be after the summer. So I think that we can pull together some actions, and probably the best way to do this is probably to get back to the all-party group and almost divide it amongst politicians, because I think there are questions that can be asked on the back of correspondence to Rishi Sunak and the follow-up. And I think there's a way of probably addressing the extremism issue as well, because politicians are more likely to get a straightforward answer quickly than freedom of information requests, which will hit a barrier when you get into these subjects. They just won't. I could list the number of freedom of information requests that we have standing for years, and in the end they say we're not going to give into information. So I think there are a number of actions that come from this, but I think the thing we kept emphasising, this isn't just about people in this room; it's about the people watching at home in the UK. This is a point in time where a number of issues have come together, but actually you do need to use your democratic rights to ask questions and ask one look. Because I think most politicians we met today, probably around about 20, all very sympathetic. Doesn't matter which political party they come from. Some of them are ministers, some are shadow ministers. And the thing is, we need to build upon this, because that positive image of the Sikhs can't be taken away by the Indian government. Simply can't, because politicians live and breathe the Sikh community in this country. They visit gurdwaras, they engage with Sikhs. And I think that is probably the one thing that will mean that our community will get stronger. And I think challenging these things is the right thing to do. The wrong thing to do would be to not challenge, because that's not what we're taught the Sikhs. We're taught the Sikhs that if we are oppressed, I think, in fact, I think the counter-terror used the word repression. They see it as a specific crime, and they regard the activities of the Indian authorities actually as repression. Now, whether they'll do anything, I'm not so sure, but because I think there has to be a political will for the police to want to prosecute those people that may be up to no good in this country looking at Sikhs. I might have missed things, but I think those are broadly the things we talked about.
If we do those 2 weeks with us, notes we can, so we're already doing. That thing is true. Well, thank you all so very much for coming this afternoon. It's been really interesting and really thought-provoking hearing. Couldn't brought pride to discuss. And as I said, let's start. This is your building, this is your police. Feel free to come in and rest of the hell at your piece whenever you like. Thank you very much.